Welcome to the Sri Lankan Understanding, a media platform aimed at understanding the path that Sri Lanka, an island in the Indian Ocean, has taken in the past, where it has enjoyed much vibrancy, and the potential that this country has going into the future. Our topic of discussion today is medicine, understanding the evolutionary nature of the practice of medicine in Sri Lanka. We're extremely honored to have with us today a very senior medical practitioner who has not only contributed to the health sector in our country, but has also done so to the international health system through the World Health Organization. He is someone who is an alumnus of the University of Peradeniya, the University of Southern California. He was a Takemi Fellow at the Harvard School of Public Health and also at the Kennedy School. He is someone who has served as WHO representative to India, in addition to having received many awards over his very illustrious career, the latest being the McLaren Leadership Achievement Award that he received at the end of 2020. Dr. Palitha Abeykoon, welcome to the Sri Lankan Understanding. Thank you so much for taking time to join us.
Thank you for inviting me.
When we look back at Sri Lanka's medical history and we go back centuries, we know there's been the practice of Ayurvedic medicine in this country. With the advent of the colonizers and Western medicine, was there conflict of some nature? How was this received? How was this perceived at that point?
Yeah, that's true. We've had at least over 2,500 years of medicine. Ayurveda may be a little less than that, not much less. But we had the kind of practice of medicine even before Ayurveda, which now has come down through the generations and got mixed up with Ayurveda and Siddha. So now we don't have a very specific ancient Sinhalese or Sri Lankan medicine called Desiya Chikitsa, which was the name given to that particular branch of medicine. So Ayurveda has more or less dominated the systems of medicine in Sri Lanka for many, many years. The first serious contact of Western medicine with Sri Lanka was with the advent of the Portuguese, 1505, that kind of period. But the Portuguese were only holding some of the maritime provinces, parts of the, so they did not get into the mainstream of Sri Lanka in terms of having a medical system of theirs to be introduced to us. They built 2 or 3 hospitals. For example, there was first hospital was in Mana, then there was one in Gaul, 2, 3 hospitals. But they were not so interested in propagating medicine as such. They were more interested as traders, that's what I've learned. That went on. Ayurveda was being practiced in the rest of the country, particularly in the Kandyan areas and elsewhere. There was a mixture of Siddha and Ayurveda in the northern area. Siddha, as you know, came from southern India. It's very much like Ayurveda, but with some differences coming from the south. Then by that time we also had Unani, which actually came through the Arabs. It's a form of Greek medicine which came through the Arabs, and the Moors who came to Sri Lanka, who were in the maritime provinces when they had problems with the Portuguese and the Dutch, they started moving inwards, and some of the Sinhalese kings during that time helped them, and they relocated them, but they also had them in their court. There were Unani physicians looking after the royal palace, for example. This word you might have heard, there's a word called Betge, and there are many Muslims in the Kandyan areas who have their name beginning with Behetge. Behetge was really the guy who was in charge of the pharmacy during and that was Unani. So Unani coexisted with Ayurveda. When the Dutch came, because they started moving inwards and they were also interested in medicine or in the health sector for their own people, the Ayurveda got a little bit of stress because of them. But nevertheless, the people were used to that, and they were living in the villages. The Dutch did not reach the villages, therefore it survived. The 3 to 4 forms of Ayurveda that you have for different things. There are 3 main things in Ayurveda that you look for: the 3 dosha, or the humors which you balance. Then also we had people who had cuts and bruises, the minor surgical things, and Ayurveda had medicines for those. And thirdly was for things like envenomation, snake bites and things like that. Still you see some of those features in the current system of Ayurveda in Sri Lanka. You get people who are specialists in these areas in some of the countries. So that has prevailed. But of course the larger, Dutch were more interested in medicine, like I said, and they are the people who built this famous Dutch hospital in Colombo. Also the eye hospital that you see, the old eye hospital, was built by the Dutch. So that time the medicine became a little bit more prominent in terms of its prevalence in the country. But still, of course, the mainstay of the medical services or medical practice and what people use, the system of medicine that people use, was more in Ayurveda style.
1926, we come to community healthcare units being set up in Sri Lanka. I believe the first was in Kalutara, and then we expanded accordingly. Over the decades, we've seen, whether it was under the British, the latter stages, or under Ceylon's administration thereafter, we've seen a large-scale expansion of healthcare provision in this country. How have we fared as a country compared to our neighbours?
Yeah, actually, the real transformation of the medical system in Sri Lanka becoming what we call allopathic or Western started obviously after the British. From the maritime provinces, when they went to Kandy, it got more and more established there. But until I think 1959, when the British, for their own reasons, to look after their own soldiers, there are people who were with them, and also the plantations, they started what we call now, then what they call the civil medical department. Before that it was only the military medical department. The civil medical department was started in 1859, if I remember. And then from there onwards they started the system of assistant medical practitioners, what we call AMPs, of course not qualified like now, but very simply trained to do simple things, but in the tradition of allopathic or Western medicine. Ayurveda was slowly getting pushed backwards, and the British, I think, consciously, unconsciously, I think they tried to propagate the Western system of medicine, sometimes at the expense of Ayurveda. The fact that Ayurveda remained so long, I think, is to attribute to the people who were practicing Ayurveda at that time. The real transformation in our health system, in public health, more than actually in clinical medicine, started, as you mentioned rightly, in 1926, when Sri Lanka opened the first what we call the health unit at Kalutara. In fact, that was the first health unit of that type in our entire subcontinent. The first time anyone, and this was an inspiration of not only the British but some American missionaries who were here. They set up the center at Kalutara, which still exists. In fact, now it is what is called the National Institute of Health Sciences, NIHS, the original the health unit that they started. That made the change, the total change in our public health system. And then they started what you now have everywhere, the medical officer of health system, the MOHS. Now, that really changed the face of medicine and health in Sri Lanka. Simultaneously, the clinical medicine also became more and more established and grew and developed. The British paid a lot of attention to clinical medicine naturally, because there are people who were here and there are people who were in the plantations, they needed medical care. They also looked after, I think basically they opened many health facilities in the villages also. So they expanded the health service in a general way, of course, with particular attention to Colombo and a few places where there are people who are working. Now, the medical school in Sri Lanka opened in 1870. That's like the first medical school. I think the first medical school in our region that the British started was the Calcutta Medical School. Second was Colombo. Until 1870, many Sri Lankan students went to Calcutta. When I say many at that time, many for that time, three in 1 year, 5 in the next year. That's large, because the Colombo Medical School also started with a very small number of students from 1870 onwards, and went on granting what at that time was called the licentiate exam, until of course it became a medical school, became a part of the university system in 1942, when they started granting the current MBBS degree here. So on one side you had the clinical medicine, the medical schools, etc., the medical school and the doctors coming out there. The AMPs continued to serve because they were the people who were serving the peripheral areas, doctors. There weren't enough doctors to go to the peripheries. Most of the doctors were concentrated in four cities in Sri Lanka: Colombo, Kandy, Galle and Jaffna, where the British people had their interests, and of course a few of them in the plantations. The AMP system is the one that kept on, kept the health of, looked after the health of the people in the clinical sense. But the main input into the improvement of our health indicators in Sri Lanka was the public health system.
Precisely.
Which in particular was taking care of the maternal and child health requires, what we call the MCH program. So as a result of that, now I remember Sri Lanka had a maternal mortality rate of about 2,000. That means for every 10,000 children who were born, 2,000 mothers died. Tremendous number of, and now we have been able to get it down to 30 per 100,000, which is one of the best in the region. Mainly because of, I think, the excellent public health system, the MOH related system that we are having in this country.
No doubt what we have started, what has been started, what has been expanded, we are seeing the results today. We are reaping the harvest of the seeds that were sown quite some time ago. When we return to the Sri Lankan Understanding, we're going to talk about where we stand in terms of communicable and non-communicable diseases as we go forward into the future. Join us again in a short while on the Sri Lankan Understanding. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. We're in conversation with Dr Palitha Abeykoon. We're talking about medicine, its evolution and practice in Sri Lanka. Dr Abeykoon, when we talk about communicable and non-communicable diseases, which is more prevalent in Sri Lanka and why?
Yeah. So if you ask me which is more prevalent right now in terms of both the sickness, that is what you call morbidity, or in terms of death, which we call mortality, the non-communicable diseases by far predominate. In fact, at least 70% of the morbidity and mortality in Sri Lanka right now is due to some kind of non-communicable disease, which is actually the reverse of what it was, say, 50 years ago, when the communicable diseases really dominated the morbidity and mortality pattern of Sri Lanka. You might recall that 1934, 35, 36, that period just before the beginning of the First World War, we had the malaria epidemic, which devastated villages, numbers of, thousands of people. Similarly, after that and before that, we have all kinds of dysenteries, diarrheas, choleras, polios, all these things, which are all communicable diseases. So that's the very sort of inspiring story of Sri Lanka, that we have been able to eliminate many of the common communicable diseases over time. Of course, communicable diseases will never go. Communicable diseases will be there forever because bugs will be there and bugs will get into people. Just as what you are experiencing now, this COVID-19. Another COVID-19 we hope won't come, but it is very unlikely it will not come.
True.
We are going to have some bug or the other at some period of our history, in our future, turning vicious. So we got to be careful about communicable diseases. Communicable diseases story is, unlike in non-communicable diseases, George, you get infected with bacterium or virus or even a fungal infection. Normally you have 2-3 causes only, limited. Most of the people get well and they come back to normal life, everything is finished. Some may have remnants. Few will succumb and die. But unlike non-communicable diseases, they don't linger forever, except a few things like TB and all. Even then, if you are fully cured, it will be finished. So you don't have to worry about it like with a non-communicable disease. Whereas non-communicable diseases, as we say, are lifestyle diseases. you have to more or less manage it and live with it. Classically, the things we are talking of would be diabetes, which is one of the commonest things. Now in Colombo we did a survey recently, almost 1 in 20 has some kind of disorder with their sugar metabolism. Hypertension, at least 30-40 people over 40 years, 50 years have at least, some of them don't know, or many of them don't even know hypertension. Different types of respiratory illnesses. And now unfortunately, of course, people are living longer in Sri Lanka, the life expectancy has grown, therefore you see more and more cancers coming up. I was told last week by the chief cancer oncologist at Maharagama that daily they see at least 70 new patients coming with cancer and with about 40 deaths. So those are the non-communicable types of diseases which are now dominating the landscape of morbidity and mortality in Sri Lanka. Another thing which I think we got to be very serious about is the road traffic injuries. Injuries and road traffic accidents in particular. Mental health. Mental health, actually we don't say it's a disease, but it's a state of, it's a disease of sorts. And mental health has become a serious problem. It is going to be a much more serious problem in time to come, like it is in the Western countries. So we have to actually prepare ourselves to manage and to handle, to mitigate them, to prevent them. Prevention is the best that we can do. Actually, for most of the non-communicable diseases, the things that we need to do are rather simple. They sound very simple, but they would be difficult for us to pursue. For example, no smoking, moderate or no use of alcohol, healthy diet, eating properly, and lifestyle, that is exercise. If one can do those 4 things, you can, I mean, ultimately, George, most of us, 70-80% of us will die because of a non-communicable disease. Now with the life expectancy becoming more and more, it will be coming late. Now what we can do by observing some of the simple precautions and behaviors that I talked of, a person who's getting, say, hypertension and getting a heart attack at 40, we can easily postpone that to 65-70. See the difference it makes. 45 means you are married, you are just going up in life, you're having little children, small children, going to university, going to school, going to university. Then you have a heart attack, the whole family is devastated. At 65, if you have to do 70, if you can manage it. So these are things we need to be careful about. Diabetes is another one. Of course, type 1 diabetes, that type of diabetes you can't do much, it comes from within. But the type 2 diabetes, which is a more common one, we can postpone it by simple observation of simple behavioral lifestyles. Sure. And we should be doing that.
In terms of that greater understanding, Dr. Abeykoon, don't you see a correlation between the free education system in this country and the relative degree of progression we have made in the health sector?
Yeah, clearly. I mean, that I think is a very classic feature of the Sri Lankan health development. The fact that we had free education, say, since the 20s or 30s, has made a number of very significant changes to our health system. The relationship is almost seamless. Number one, overall it increased what we call the health literacy of the population. The kinds of things that we talked about, many of our people know. It's not a question of knowledge, sure. It's a question of behavior, exactly. Translating that. So that's the transition we have to somehow force. Secondly, and very importantly, the education or the literacy of the mothers, the women, I think that is the one that really changed the total picture of health in this country. Now, for example, we have, say, Sri Lanka, I think we give protection by way of vaccination. I'm not talking about the COVID one, which is just coming, but for the children, we have at least 10 different diseases you are protected before you are 2 years old. And in most instances, in these cases, the mothers bring the children, and we have the highest immunization rates in Southeast Asia. 99% of our children are protected against these diseases by the age of 2-3. And unlike in other countries, Sri Lanka is one country I have seen, and this I have seen in many other countries, the difference is one country where the mothers will know when to bring the child for vaccination. So sometimes they will come and demand. So the vaccination or the immunization system in Sri Lanka has now turned into a demand driven system. Actually, health system should be ultimately demand driven. But most of our health system, the rest of it is supply driven. That's why we are having some gaps and difficulties. But with regard to child health and particularly the expanded program of immunization, it has done very well, and mainly because of the education of the mothers.
Exactly.
So many things like that, yeah.
Precisely. And we've been talking about medicine in Sri Lanka, its evolution and practice, and how we have had in the past systems that have been put into place, systems that have now yielded results, and going into the future. That's exactly what we're going to talk about when we come back in the third segment of this program on the Sri Lankan Understanding. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding, Medicine, its Evolution and Practice in Sri Lanka. We're in conversation with Dr. Palitha Abeykoon. Sir, you are one of the 6 internationally reputed medical practitioners, professionals, who has been appointed by the World Health Organization's Director General to advise him with regard to the ongoing pandemic and measures that are being taken globally. You've had a vast experience with the international health sector. When you look at what we have experienced in the past, from a Sri Lankan perspective, going into the future, what are the main challenges that we face and how are we going to overcome them?
It's a very tough question to answer. There's so much that needs to be said. Yeah, thank you very much for asking that question, because I think that's probably the most important part that we can discuss. Very briefly, we can say that Sri Lanka has been providing good health at low cost, and what we have done is universally acknowledged. In fact, the famous Alma Ata Declaration that the WHO passed in 1978 was partially inspired by the work that took place in Sri Lanka, Kerala and Cuba.
Wow.
So we have an excellent track record and reputation. But of course now things have been changing. We now, as we discussed in the earlier segment, the non-communicable diseases have come to the center stage with regard to our health issues, health problems. So now we have a situation, we can still face it, but we have a situation where we need to change our health strategies or the way we have been delivering health. For example, most of these diseases, non-communicable diseases, can be handled at a very lower level. They don't have to come to the tertiary hospitals. I mean, tertiary hospitals are necessary for the high level, high order of procedures, but not diabetes, hypertension. They all can be managed at the primary health care level. So we need, and I think the government is now moving in this direction with this primary health care strengthening project, we need to develop a system where this will be handled closer to the people, because these are diseases which need continuous attention. So it's useless having somebody coming to Colombo, traveling 4-5 hours by bus and getting some medicine, going back, because that does not help. This is something that every week, every month, every year you have to be in touch with. So that's the first thing that we need to somehow strengthen. And this is also under the WHO umbrella rubric of what we call universal health coverage, giving the essential services to everyone without any distinction at a cost or that he or she can afford. Sri Lanka, that has not been an issue, because most of our public health system, for most of the time, continues to be free at the point of delivery. But what you notice, George, right now is somehow the basic services are free, but we find that the so-called out-of-pocket expenses of the people is getting rather high. For example, the latest studies on health financing that we have, it's almost 50-50. 50% is what you get from the government on a cost basis, and people spend 50% of the other health expenses out of pocket. And the poorer people spend most of this money for two things. One is for medicines, the other is for laboratory investigations. So we have to make sure that these are available to these people. Of course, there will be a private sector, and I think the private sector has come to stay. So maybe we can make the private sector more efficient and make the private sector have some kind of quote-unquote partnership with the public sector in the years to come. So we have to think of that. But at the end of it, Sri Lanka, and I always maintain this, Sri Lanka, we need to invest a little bit more in health. The government sector investment is about 1.8% of the GDP. The private sector also, in the private sector, people also spend another maybe 1.4, 1.5% of the GDP privately for private health. But still, that is not adequate. Because the diseases that we are now facing are diseases which, as we say in health, these are the diseases which can break the bank, because they are all expensive. To manage lifestyle diseases, to manage non-communicable diseases is much more expensive because there is no end to it. So you need more and more investment in health, and therefore the best way is to delay the appearance of these diseases as long as possible by changing your lifestyles and the way we do things.
Precisely. Thank you very much, Dr. Abeykoon, for sharing with us.
But we still have we are, I think, compared to most countries in the region that I know, we are still quite well poised to handle these problems.
Absolutely.
If we manage it intelligently and efficiently.
If we have done it in the past, we can do it in the future. There certainly is the potential for that to happen. We just have to strategize accordingly and make sure that where we are going. And if strategizing was something that the pandemic has taught us, we've realized that health is wealth. Going into the future, we realize the value of having a healthy life, of waking up each morning and being healthy, being able to move around, being able to engage in employment, education, carry on with life and live life in a meaningful manner. And that is something that in Sri Lanka we have come to experience for several decades. We've had a free health system, we've had the free education system augmenting what has been provided, supporting it and ensuring that people have become that much more aware of the need for a healthy lifestyle. It is technically in our hands in order to ensure that as we go forward as a healthy nation, as a healthy people, we are able to contribute that much more. And as was mentioned, Sri Lanka has done extremely well from a global perspective when we look at how the country has fared, even in response to what has been taking place in the last few decades or even in the last couple of years. On the Sri Lankan Understanding today, we talked about medicine, its evolution and practice here in Sri Lanka. Extremely honored to have had one of the senior most health professionals, not just in Sri Lanka or in South Asia, but someone who has been recognized internationally, Dr. Palitha Abeykoon. And that's where we end the Sri Lankan Understanding for today. Join us again next time for another episode where we look at this country, the potential it has experienced in the past, and what we can do in the years and decades ahead. Thank you.